How can the religious get things so obviously wrong all the time? That's the question I ask today as we dive into part 2 of proving Jesus existed, yet doing nothing remotely of the sort. And this is a cautionary tale for the religious to actually do some research into the things that you claim before you make a complete fool of yourself. Because this is really common. So let's get into it. It constantly amazes me just how ignorant the religious actually are about, everything. They constantly make claims that are easily proven false, such that there's no way in the world that they could not know that they were false unless they were actively avoiding researching the subject. Which I think a lot of them are. This isn't about facts, this is about feelings, and the religious are just dumb enough not to give a crap whether what they believe is actually true or not. So here we go again with yet another clear and obvious example of just that. Strap in, here we go with part 2 of proving Jesus existed. Now, before we get started, I did go back and look at this channel, and they have lots and lots of lists of things that supposedly prove Christianity. Although, let's be honest, after seeing the first video on the existence of Jesus, this is really pretty pedestrian stuff, and the presentation is uniformly awful. This stuff is meant to be viewed on a cell phone, and Speedy Gonzalez here doesn't sound like he's well-versed in making videos at all. So I'm going to leave this up to my viewing audience whether or not they want me to pursue any more of this. I'm only doing this video because in the last, he mentioned eyewitness testimony of Jesus in passing, and I didn't feel I could just walk away without addressing it. But let me know if you'd like me to go on and continue doing this series, or maybe jump on to others like the resurrection. So, with that out of the way, let's get cracking.
Part 2 of proving Jesus existed. In part 1 I talked about how exactly I'd be proving Jesus existed, and I brought the topic of eyewitness testimonies, which is what I'll be talking about in this video.
It'll be interesting to see what he comes up with, since we have absolutely no demonstrable eyewitness testimony to Jesus whatsoever. None. Zero. Zip. Zilch. There aren't any. And this is something that messes up a lot of theists. We don't have any accounts where the author says, I personally saw Jesus do X. At least not reliably or verifiably. All of the ones outside of the Bible, and we'll get to that later, but every single extra-biblical account is told by people who weren't alive during the supposed time of Jesus and are just relating stories that they heard from believers. That's not testimony at all, much less eyewitness testimony. That's just hearsay. None of these people actually saw Jesus. They just heard stories about him like a giant game of telephone. And that's actually a very accurate analogy. You have to remember that back in those days, virtually everyone was illiterate. They couldn't read and they couldn't write. They relied on a very small number of people to read to them out of the very few stories and accounts that were there. Which is why the early church was set up the way that it was. You had a bunch of people who couldn't read, sitting around, listening to one guy in the front who could. That's why these stories weren't written down for decades, and in that time, there were variations. But let's get back to our fast-talking theist.
So the main eyewitness accounts we have are from the disciples and apostles, who were the closest people to Jesus on earth.
Except we don't. We know that the Gospels were written anonymously, and it was only later, many years later, that the church attached names to them in keeping with church tradition. We have no idea, none whatsoever, who actually wrote the Gospels, and we have a lot of really good reasons to doubt that they were written by the people whose names eventually ended up on them. Even Bible scholars agree with this. In the overview of the New Testament, the Oxford Annotated Bible states, "Neither the evangelists nor their first readers engaged in historical analysis. Their aim was to confirm Christian faith, as in Luke 1:4, John 20:31, etc. Scholars generally agree that the Gospels were written 40 to 60 years after the death of Jesus. They thus do not present eyewitness or contemporary accounts of Jesus' life and teachings." So we already know that the Bible was not written to present the facts in the Jesus narrative. It was intended to tell a story to convince a generally ignorant audience to follow their beliefs. That doesn't make any of it factually correct. So we can go back into the text itself and find that the narratives are internally anonymous. Absolutely none of the Gospels named the authors within them. Now, that was not common in the time. Many other sources actively name their author, including books written by Thucydides, Josephus, and Herodotus, among others. And of course, this goes for many other books in the New Testament, like some of the books attributed to John, and some traditionally claimed to have been written by Paul. Books like Hebrews, nobody actually knows. It is important to point out here that even many apologists have been forced to acknowledge this simple fact. Craig Blomberg, who states in Lee Strobel's The Case for Christ on page 22, it's important to acknowledge that, strictly speaking, the Gospels are anonymous. Yeah, strictly speaking, called It's a Fact. So these are not eyewitness accounts by any means. These are stories, the validity of which we simply cannot verify. The religious would like them to be true, but they cannot demonstrate them to be true. And that's a very important distinction.
And these people documented the life of Jesus in the 4 books we know today as the Gospels. There are also non-biblical sources as well from the Jewish historian Josephus.
Let's stop you right there. Because Josephus, by definition, could not have been an eyewitness account because he could not have been born until after the supposed death of Jesus. Even at the most charitable, Jesus might have died as late as 33 CE, although it was more likely somewhere between 25 and 27 CE. Josephus wasn't even born until 37 CE, thus he couldn't possibly have been an eyewitness. He simply wasn't around. Now, I'm sure we'll see this time and time again, because all of the classically named external sources that the religious tend to come up with, they were all born far too late to have ever seen Jesus alive. And you'd think this would bother the religious, because it should. But they don't care. They're either ignorant, and there's no excuse for that with the internet around, or they're just plain dumb. Take your pick. Now, in the case of Josephus, the passage in question simply doesn't exist in the earliest versions of his Jewish antiquities. It was a clear case of early Christian forgery, of which there are many other examples. Josephus never wrote it, and that passage in particular, the one that mentions Jesus, is written in a completely different voice than the passages preceding and following it in the text. If you remove it entirely, the passages hang together very well. That part, the part that was obviously a forgery, has very glaring textual differences. So it's all just a few false passages placed by delusional Christians in a desperate attempt to validate their beliefs. Honestly, what else is new?
And the Roman historian Tacitus,
who also wasn't born until after the supposed era of Jesus. Tacitus wasn't born until 56 CE, thus, once again, not an eyewitness. Now, it's possible that Tacitus wrote the account that the Christians are talking about, which appears in Annals, Book 15, Chapter 44, but clearly it was never intended to talk about Jesus, only early Christians. That part only comes in passing. It comes directly after a passage describing the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE and describes the persecution of Christians, not Jesus, Christians, who were being blamed by some because blaming Nero was politically inconvenient, especially since Nero himself had targeted the Christians as a distraction. Now, keep in mind that Tacitus calls the leader of the Christians Chrestus, not Jesus, and then says that this Chrestus was put to death by Pontius Pilate. Certainly that follows the traditional Christian narrative, but we have to ask ourselves where he got that information. Did Tacitus do independent research and look up what might have been, at the time, existing Roman records? Or did he just ask the Christians what happened and wrote down whatever they said? The latter is far, far more likely. Tacitus is not known to be a terribly well-researched author. But keep in mind that we lack the original manuscript. Annals has been lost to history and is only known through two remaining copies known as the Medicean manuscripts. So we don't know what he actually wrote, and we have to rely on some anonymous Middle Ages scribe to tell us what was in there. Regardless, Tacitus never saw Jesus, and thus he cannot be considered to be an eyewitness account.
And keep in mind that the early Jews and Romans were the worst enemies of Jesus, but even they didn't say that Jesus never existed.
They didn't actually mention Jesus at all, at least not in official records. Keep in mind that the Romans were meticulous record keepers, so if Pilate really put Jesus to death, it would have been recorded somewhere. These things didn't just happen on a whim. Now, it's certainly possible that these records have been lost over the centuries. These things certainly do happen. But the Christians have to explain why these records don't exist, because they have nothing that they can actually point to. The records are gone. How do they know this crap is real, except within their religious stories? They pretend that there is all of this evidence, but when you actually sit down and look at it, there's really nothing there to examine. And this should be, a problem for the religious, except, as I keep saying, they just don't care. They really don't. Your typical Christian on the street, they just don't give a damn. If the apologists say that these records exist, then, for all intents and purposes, these records exist, whether they actually do or not. They're not going to go and do any research on their own, as it's painfully clear that our fast-talking friend here didn't. It fits their narrative, they want to believe it, therefore it's got to be true. Except reality doesn't really work that way.
You can read a lot of Tacitus writings about Jesus in the works Annals and Histories,
which, as I already said, we don't actually have original manuscripts of anymore. That means we need to trust scribes from the Middle Ages, religious scribes from the Middle Ages, to have accurately copied these passages. Can we? I don't know. And neither do you.
What's interesting about Tacitus is that he talks about Jesus and his followers in a very derogatory way, but he still acknowledges that he was a real person, because it would just been stupid to say Jesus never existed.
Nobody denies the existence of Christians. It's the validity of his claims about Jesus, or Chrestus, or whatever you want to say, that matter, and at the center of that inquiry is, where did he get his information? The most likely answer is that he just asked Christians and recorded their stories. And that doesn't necessarily make them true. Tacitus had no way to verify any of this. It's why the passage means absolutely nothing.
You can even read Lucian's work and see that he makes fun of Christians for worshipping Jesus as he was crucified.
Lucian of Samosata was born in 125 CE, thus not an eyewitness. The passage in question was written around 170 CE, recounting the words of a speaker in a town square after a man named Proteus had thrown himself into a fire. So it wasn't even Lucian speaking here. It was an unverified tale by someone who also couldn't have been an eyewitness of Jesus. Lucian doesn't even mention Jesus by name, calling him the Christian first lawgiver. This is just more telling of tall tales, something that Lucian was well known for. He even wrote A True Story, which was a satire of imaginary stories that included space travel, aliens, and an interstellar war. I think we have sufficient reason to doubt that this account proves anything about any real Jesus. It's all kinda silly when you think about it, but Christians are desperate and they'll go to almost any lengths.
So we know there is non-biblical and biblical eyewitness testimonies.
And I've just proven that absolutely none of them were eyewitness testimonies. This guy doesn't even know what the hell those words mean. An eyewitness is someone who sees something with their own eyes. They have to be physically present at the event, and none of these could have been. And this is exactly why we have to spend so much time digging through the religious mire to find out what the hell they're doing. Because what they're doing isn't honest. Ever. I think we can safely say ever. Because this is really the level of scholarship that we see from most Christian apologists. They desperately want to believe, so they find something that can, if you look at it just right and ignore reality, be interpreted as support for their faith. Yet when you dig deeper, it's clear that it does absolutely nothing of the sort. And this guy has no excuse. He could have looked up when Lucian or Tacitus or Josephus lived and realized that none of them could have been eyewitnesses. In fact, at least in the case of Lucian, absolutely no one still alive at the time could have been an eyewitness. It was 140 years at the very least after the supposed crucifixion of Jesus. This in a time where the average lifespan was 66 years. But hey, that's inconvenient, so clearly the religious just ignore it.
But what if these accounts are made up? I'll explain that in part 3, so make sure to go check that out.
I honestly don't know that it's worth my time to go through this guy's crap because obviously he's been absurdly wrong in pretty much every word that's come out of his mouth at 1,000,000 miles an hour, at least when you can understand what he's saying. But let's be honest, this is the same kind of crap that most apologists go with, and if I can completely debunk every single bit of it with 5 minutes on Google, then there is something really wrong with these people. It's like they don't care. Because they don't. This is why historians care so much about having multiple, independent, demonstrably eyewitness accounts to determine what actually happened in the past. And the Christians have absolutely none of that. There isn't a single account that can be proven to have been written by an actual eyewitness. Not one. And in fact, all of the claimed eyewitness accounts out there, as we've just seen, we can prove they weren't actually eyewitnesses. How exactly does that work? Because these people simply aren't concerned. We can look at these and find out that's false. And there are others we could look at as well, like Pliny the Younger, or Suetonius, or Thallus, or Phlegon. But none of them fare any better. For both Thallus and Phlegon, none of their works survive to this day, and we have to rely on later, almost entirely Christian sources making claims about what they might have said without actually being able to prove that any of it actually happened. And they weren't eyewitnesses either. But you know who would have been eyewitnesses? People like Seneca and Paterculus and Philo and Pliny the Elder, among many, many others, all of whom lived at the same time and in the same area as Jesus supposedly did, and most certainly would have taken notice of someone rising from the dead. Yet none of them ever did. Imagine that. This whole thing falls apart the second you give it more than a passing glance, which is why the religious never do that. They can't, because they don't care, and that's where all the problems come from. Just maybe they ought to care, because maybe if they did, they wouldn't hold such obviously absurd beliefs. And wouldn't that be nice?
bum